this. Right, cool. You guys are being recorded. There's a request. If you do, please accept. If not, you guys will be automatically removed. So yeah, a few house rules before we start the debate. Number one, before we start that, also, this quarterfinal has a panelist. I would also like to invite my panelists to introduce themselves. Before that, my name is Farhan. I'll be a chair for this quarterfinal. Congratulations to make it to the quarterfinal. All the best and make us proud. We'll give it to the next panel based on the arrangement given by the draws.
Hi everyone, I'm Benedict. Congratulations to both teams. All the best to this debate.
Hello, my name is Manda. Prefer pronounce he or him. Good luck.
Right, cool. Now a few house rules. Number one, since this is an online debate tournament, please indicate your preferred POI preferences, whether you guys want it to be chat, whether prefer it to be verbal. Second, please indicate if comfortable, please indicate your preferred gender pronouns. If unable to do so, please at least try your best to be gender neutral possible, i.e. refer to the speaker as Prime Minister and Leader of Opposition. And last, please also time yourself. If I will also have a timestamp in the chat box. If in a situation unable to do so because I might be a horrible timer, please time yourself. With that being said, on the motion about what's the motion again? Religion endorsing politics, etc. I'd like to invite the Prime Minister. Ready when you are.
Okay, I just need one moment for my timer, and I prefer POIs visually. The separation of religion from state is necessary for society to function, in that religious affiliations and personal systems of faith are individualized to you on a personal scale. But the absolutism of religion forces those values to be applied in a way so that politics and the compromise that politics requires cannot function alongside fundamentalism and obligations to omnipresence beyond ourselves. I'll do three things in this speech. First, I'll set up the debate, then I'll talk about why this is coercive expression of self-expression through politics, and then I'll talk about why we should be separating religion and state on a practical level and the implications that has for politics and like your personal practice of religion. Okay, 2 points to set up then. The first thing is to say that on our side, religious leaders will not be publicly telling the general masses their views on politically related concepts like candidates or parties. General consensus within religions declare that religious leaders should stay neutral and detached from politics. For instance, Buddhism, where Buddhists and community leaders actively do not bring up politics in their communions. My first point then, why this is coercive to self-expression politics. People listen to the views of the religious leaders, and disobeying religion entails the threat of eternal damnation in hell, whereas following religion entails salvation in heaven, which artificially and psychologically manipulates people into staying in religion for fear of the infinite consequences of leaving religion, but also going against religion and religious leaders. So if religious authorities speak out to you and tell you that this is the party that is morally correct and shows who you are as a person and as a representation of your faith, then you have to follow that. Like whatever they're telling you, and to follow that kind of vote. Authority figures within religions, like priests, can claim to have a closer or more moral and direct connection with supreme figures like God, which makes their word more important and more valuable than the word of regular religious adherents or just yourself. As a consequence, people are more inclined to trust religious authority figures, even when religious teachings can contradict their own values. Not to mention, many people are indoctrinated into religion from a young age because parents indoctrinate them heavily with religious norms and raise them in accordance with religious practices and teach them religious stories that emphasize the harms that befall those that disobey God. Since people's formative years are the most important development of their long-term outlook on the world, people are often not given the opportunity to consent to religion and are left trapped inside of it and trapped in a cycle believing they have to do whatever it is that religion tells them to do. Some people within religious communities are often locked out of accessing alternative perspectives, and this is structurally likely because religious elites have the incentive to keep members trapped within the insular religious societies to maximize their own material and spiritual power. But on our side, that consent isn't completely restored in our world, but we ameliorate the harm of furthering that degree of violation of consent, as now that violation extends to even further rights, including your right to vote and your right to express through politics. On our side, this is different, because lots of religious people don't view religion as political. They just view it as a way to get purpose or meaning or have some greater fulfillment in life and find what it is that makes them truly happy. They do look for guidance of their life values in religion, but not the exact candidate that they should vote for. That personalized practice of religion allows for people to find the candidates that best fit their needs, but also practice religion in a way that's not restricting them to certain political ideologies. Lots of religious ideas also can be involved with multiple parties. For example, on the left, you can justify giving to the poor, but on the right, you can justify abortion. And also, if it's not explicitly said, it gives people the choice to be able to make the best decisions for themselves and have personal interpretations of religion and reflect that through votes. For example, some people might interpret religion to being the religious values that they're reading about to be they should vote for a certain party, but others might say you vote for a different party. So that kind of personal practice is what happens on our side. But why is that coercion especially dire, and why does that vote people have so important? People's vote and participation in politics is central to their identity and well-being, as your vote is a form of self-defense you have against unjust governments and against ways in which a state can harm you. That representation is crucial when the state is an actor that takes away your liberty, restricts your autonomy, and makes it so that you aren't able to ever live in a completely free manner. So democracy is a reparative obligation that society has to individuals in order to avoid the war's harms, but also to provide them with a way to have their voices heard. But also, on this entire thing about coercion, the fact that like religion is so absolute means that it's impossible for politics to function principally under the spring. Because if you believe that to the extent at which religion is absolutist and you have to follow a certain interpretation, otherwise you're going to be condemned to hell, that means that the politics literally cannot exist under the circumstance, because politics is about compromise and it's about finding an aggregation of preferences and the least objectionable alternatives, as opposed to being hardline on your stances and always trying to achieve the same aim that you're not willing to concede under any circumstance. This takes me to my second point then, and why we should be separating religion and state on a practical level. But before that, I'll take a POI.
Note that this argument is about politics hyper generally, which can still absolutely be publicly talked about under their side of the house. The motion specifies candidacies and elections. They can still talk about political concepts. I don't think the mechanization here is specific.
Okay, but like when you force someone to vote for a specific party, that's more coercive than telling them certain policies are good. Because certain policies are good doesn't mean that they vote for certain candidates, and maybe they have other policies that they value more. But it's just like having a specific candidate you have to vote for is so much more morally coercive, because it locks you out of other structural options, and it means that you have to vote for things that you aren't even like preferable to you. Okay, second point then on why we should be separating religion and state on the practical level. As religion and politics becomes entangled, the absolutist interpretations of religion mean that the two become impossible to separate. Because when religious leaders speak out more in politics, they justify it by tying it back to religion. This looks like saying things like this policy or this party is in line with the beliefs we preach, and this is the policy that listens to the voice of their God. And as your religion determines your value and outlook on life, politics is the best way for you to get those values instilled in broader society, which is important to you if you believe in the religion as you believe in all the people who don't believe you. I want to note that on our side, in order to spread those values, because you don't have the avenue of politics, you do it through other things like social campaigns or recruitment methods, which may be coercive, but are far less coercive than having actual candidates and actual laws that restrict people's autonomy and force people to have their rights taken away and not be able to exercise their freedom to that extent. But what just happens in the status quo? Some religious leaders may speak on these topics, not major ones, but local pastors and ministers. This coercion is what allows people like Donald Trump to violate the very premise of respect and harmony in religion to get elected. But level of coercion will only increase because of the fact that politics is becoming more and more polarized, and that means that more and more political parties will try to appeal to religious leaders in order to get votes. And what this gets is laws created that propagate certain religions. As more powerful religions will be able to galvanize believers to vote on the basis of their claims, while weaker ones and ones that are already vulnerable in the status quo will not be able to have the same amount of political galvanization, which means that their beliefs and their values never get instilled in society. But it also means that they aren't able to practice their religions to the same degree because of the fact that other religions are just more prominent and they have more of a voting bloc, so they can force certain things to happen. On the flip side, when religious leaders don't speak on them, maybe other people on religion might, but those are less like maybe like your fellow believers of that religion, but that's less coercive as not a direct message from God, but rather your friends' interpretations. So when these leaders are banned from speaking on these topics, there are two parts to the benefits. Firstly, on politics, because prominent religions will not be able to influence politics to such a massive degree, people have a better shot at getting their life values, regardless of religion, instilled in politics, and they have a better shot at getting the policies they want and that will benefit them the most. But also, we protect religious pluralism because it's very easy for one single religion to take over under the circumstance that many societies do have a religious majority. Like in America, that's like Christianity, and in like I guess a lot of Asian countries, that's like Buddhism. But the second part of the benefits is on the practice of religion. As your vote and participation in politics are so central to your autonomy and a part of your self-expression through religion, you can exercise your own personal interpretation of religion through your vote, which allows you to have a better relationship with your religion, as you can have a personalized interpretation and be able to find the ways in which religion best befits you. We're proud to propose.
Right, thank you for the fine speech. Now to invite the opposition or speaker for the negative team.
Hey everybody, that's Jake Zheng. I'll be giving the opposition one, and I'll take verbal POIs, please. Everybody ready? All right, perfect. I'll just get started then. On a fundamental level, everyone should be allowed to express their beliefs. No matter how unpopular they are, freedom of speech does not exist if it does not encompass the freedom to disagree. We recognize that not all beliefs are necessarily acceptable, but totally banning them from being expressed is wrong on both a moral level and in the real world. For these reasons, we're so proud to oppose. Just 3 things in this speech. First, some clarifications on framing, then refuting side propositions content before giving our first 2 substantive arguments. My partner Alex will be giving you our third. Now let's clarify the framing of today's debate a little. Note that what actually constitutes political opinions remains nebulous on proposition. That is to say, it's up to governments to interpret that and enforce it as they see fit. Propositions don't have fiat power to change all of their incentives and pass an ideal version of the policy according to how they interpreted it. This is going to be important later when we discuss authoritarian abuse of this power. Secondly, note that this is a bit different from aligning yourself with a political party, like in round 2. Proposition burdens to ban religious leaders from expressing any opinions on parties, any opinions on candidates, and any opinions on policies entirely, not just associating themselves with a particular political party. But thirdly, then, we would note that side proposition forgets that Christianity is not the only religion in the world. We see that religions like Buddhism and Hinduism often express progressive views about the world that call on us to all be open and accepting to others unconditionally, aside from the which in contrast to the absolutism that they try to characterize existing religions around the world. We say that other religions emphasize that you have to be open, emphasize that you have to express new beliefs, that you have to understand other people's beliefs, and not just that you have to make this decision or you go to hell. That's just side proposition just simply mischaracterizes that here. Now let's respond to the 2 arguments that they just gave you. Note that throughout their whole case, they never prove even once by voting off of religion is a bad thing. People in democracy should fundamentally have the choice to vote how they want because of different reasons. It's morally reprehensible that side proposition is saying it's wrong to vote for certain reasons. We think we should let people choose to reasons why they vote, that we should let people choose why they want to vote. Side proposition shouldn't be controlling why people want to vote in the first place. Now to their arguments. They started with this argument about coercion. They say that politics can't function under religion because it's very absolutist. They think that every single religious person thinks that they're going to hell if they make one bad political decision. We think this is a fundamental mischaracterization. Again, number 1, there's other religions like Buddhism and Hinduism that are more open. Number 2, even within these religions like Christianity, not everyone is an extremist or fundamentalist. There's different levels of people practicing religion. Not everyone just thinks they're going to hell if they make one bad decision. But secondly, we think that religion and politics can function under the same realm. Why is that true? This looks like Pope Francis justifying policies like welfare because it functions off these same values that are emphasized by the Bible. They then tell you that most people are indoctrinated into practicing religion. Note that this actually happens on our side. Either side. Note that we would actually advocate that this gets better under our side. Why is that so true? We open up more diverse perspectives to these people. We're going to expand on this later, but the political realm necessitates diverse perspectives and interaction with those perspectives. But secondly, they gave me this argument about separation of church and state. This functions off the fundamental belief that people should not be voting from their religion. Side propositions being very paternalist when they try to command the reasons why religious people are voting in the first place. We think that if a person wants to vote because a certain candidate supports similar values that the religion does, it's fundamentally wrong that we're telling them they can't vote off of that. Again, they never prove why it's fundamentally wrong that people are voting because of their religions. Then they say that religious majorities will just take over. That's fundamentally wrong. We think that on either side, people are just going to hold beliefs that are justified by their religions. However, on our side uniquely, we get better diversity in beliefs because, again, if a person is involved in politics, they're going to be fundamentally exposed to new perspectives and other people will be exposed to their perspective then. But before I get into substantive content, are there any points? Okay, seeing none, I'm just going to continue then. Our first substantive is on the principle of freedom of speech. The thesis of this argument is that principally, the right to express your political opinions as a religious leader is entrenched as a human being. When do we as a society support free speech and political expression? We generally support free speech to the degree that it is not inciting violence or promoting hate speech with violent implications. That's an exemption to the political speech of religious leaders that we support and is already ingrained in common law around the world. We see this precedent exist in Brandenburg versus Ohio in the United States, where the Supreme Court ruled you can't just yell fire in a crowded theater building. It's constitutionally illegal for these kinds of actions or worse to pervade. It's reasonable to assume that the same holds for this motion, meaning hate speech and damaging speech is banned on either side of the House. Why then is governmental restriction and the over-limiting of rights a harmful precedent to set? We think that in establishing a precedent and restriction of rights and freedoms, it's easier for this to be justified by any practical argument and any political statement or opinion made by a religious leader can just be struck down or retained depending on whether or not it favors a government in question. Any ability for the government to selectively interpret and select what type of speech should stay in place and in turn what shouldn't impedes on the meaning of free speech. The impacts here are incredibly simple. The principal argument operates independent of any consideration of the practical. Why is that so true? It's because crucially, it doesn't actually matter whether or not restrictions on religious leaders from opining on politics is pragmatically beneficial. It actually doesn't matter if it ends up resulting in more progressive policies or whatever. The action of stripping the right of speech in and of itself is principally immoral. But our second substantive then is on political support. The thesis of this argument is that religious leaders expressing their beliefs in politics galvanize support within the religious realm and make people vote and engage when they otherwise would not have. With this new engagement comes interaction with more diverse perspectives, both within and outside of the church, leads to a much bigger variety and more beneficial beliefs on our side. But before I get into that, I'll take a point.
Our burden in this round wasn't to say that religion and people cannot make views based on religion, but rather that the religion itself should not make the link between the religious views and a particular political party.
Okay, what we're telling you on our side is that people can vote off of religion. There's justifications that exist within religion for certain policy. We told you Pope Francis has been advocating for welfare because it's supported by the Bible. We would say that it's absolutely wrong for people to say that we shouldn't be voting off of religion or religion should not play a part in politics, because we are saying that if people believe in a certain religion and believe in certain beliefs, they should be able to vote off of those beliefs. But now then back to our substantive case. Let's first characterize how we directly get engagements on our side. We think that these religious leaders currently have very large audiences, large religious congregations, full of people who hold these same religious beliefs as them and listen to their advice. What's the problem that side proposition creates then? Fundamentally, we would say that its religion has little reconciliation with politics. That is to say, it's pretty difficult for a person who's religious and has their own religious beliefs to take those beliefs and carry them over into politics. What changes then when we allow these leaders to express their opinions? We get better engagement through the religious realm. We get better political interaction for the people within these religious groups who really will only vote when you combine religion and politics. A few key benefits out of this then. We say that first, we get direct civic engagement. When more people have the right to vote, it's best because equal representation works best when the voter base is largest. That only happens under our side. The second benefit under here is better activism. We think that religious leaders have the ability to apply religion to crucial issues. We say this looks like the Mormon Church expressing their support for the respect for marriage legislation that just passed in the US that supported gay and interracial marriage. But note that on either side of the house, you're going to have people who support these bigoted and homophobic perspectives that they've largely been indoctrinated into as side proposition gives you. You're going to have hyper-conservative religious groups like the Westboro Baptist Church advocating for homophobia. Even if you prevent them from doing this in the political realm, they're going to hold and spread these beliefs on either side. What's the comparative here then? Sure, they may ban these religious beliefs from being spread in the political realm. However, they're still going to be spread within individual churches' sermons and Sunday morning worships. What happens under our side then that's uniquely beneficial? We think that you get better interaction from all the other perspectives of the political realm, given that politics necessitates interaction. These beliefs are also now more well known, meaning that in their world, they stay more hidden, but now in our world, politics can call these people out for the bigots that they are. The impact is very simple here. You get greater support of important policies and governmental action. For these reasons, so proud to oppose.
All right, thank you for that fine speech. Give me a sec. All right, with that being said, I'd like to invite the Deputy Prime Minister or second speaker for the communities.
Okay, great. Sounds good. I take PRs exclusively in chat, so if you can type it there, that'll be great. I have had horrible Wi-Fi today, so preferably I'm not going to turn on my camera if that's okay.
No problem.
Okay, cool. I'll start in 3. Wait, sorry. Okay, I'll start in 3, 2, 1. To make it very clear, as Jessica did within her model, our side doesn't necessarily need to say that people should not vote on the basis of their own genuine religious opinions, but rather this motion explicitly states that the leaders of these religions should not declare which certain political candidate or party is better than another religious view, which means that all of their content on how this is overall going to be bad for our side of the house, how it basically prevents people from making their genuine decisions based on democracy and their religious views, is fallen out of round, given that it's not just within what we need to defend. So for instance, to people who believe in Buddhism and Hinduism can still express their progressive views. So if they believe that this party is better in line with the opinions of their religion, they're still able to vote for that. The difference on our side then versus their side then is that religious leaders will not declare that certain candidates are better or certain candidates are more in God's name and certain candidates are genuinely far likely to go to heaven than hell. Rather, we see on our side of the house, there will be a general consensus within religions that say religious leaders should stay neutral and detached from politics. So for instance, in Buddhism, many Buddhist and community leaders actively do not bring politics into their communities and discussions. Rather, they can say inherently progressive opinions, but they do not say that they endorse the Democrat Party or that they do not support the Republican Party at all. That is something that is inherently not said at all. So if it is up to the individual person to make that link, we see religious leaders do not make that link on our side of a house. I'll talk about two things then. Firstly, on the principle and expressions, and second of all, on the idea of politics. Under the first idea, I just want to point out that we made it very clear that on our side of us, we say we do not support the coercion of the religion that it does under people's general opinions when they choose to vote. I want to note that this, and what we said this was coercive, and all of the mechanisms got no response from their side of the house, is that many people are actually forced to make considered opinions based on the opinions of their religious leaders. And the reason why for this, and the overarching thing that they never responded with properly, which is our case at the best, is not just what is being said, but rather how it is being framed. Because for a religious leader to bring religion into the context of politics, they need to link politics to religion. And how they do as often by saying, this political candidate is far and more in line with our religion. This political candidate is actually what God would have wanted you to choose. This is what this political candidate is what allows society to be in God's favor. And given that you buy into the religion and you buy into the threat of eternal damnation if you do not follow God's word, and you buy into the idea that these priests are the ones who are closest to the words of God, you're likely to buy into that and you're forced into making that opinion. We say on Orthodox, we give people more choice, because if it is the case that their own opinions are so in line with their religion and thus so in line with that political party, then they will make that link naturally on either side of the house. This motion only applies implicitly then when these people's views were different from the religious leader. And we say at that point, we say it is coercive. Their response to say is that it is okay for people to vote from opinions based on religion. The first point is just that, as I've proven, this can happen on both sides of the house. If the progressive opinion their religion shows is better encompassed by the Democrat Party, people can vote that way. We say we actually give more choice in Orthodox when we make individuals make the link themselves. But second, I just want to point out that it's actually rather coercive for them to be told that they must vote this way, because the way religious leaders say and endorse this candidate is often just by linking this directly to the word of God, to the word of Bible, and say, because I am the priest and the supreme leader of this court or this church, or because I am the one that's closer to supreme figures like Allah, thus you should vote for this one. We see that is at a point where it is coercive. But thirdly, if they want to talk about corruption, we see it is far more likely to happen on their side of the house. Note that religious leaders often have immense amounts of power and sway within their own churches. At a point which their word is considered the most valuable and they can actually influence politics to a large extent, it doesn't necessarily even need to be in line with the religion. They just endorse a certain candidate if that is what benefits them most. Think about in the past when the church and the state were not separated, where religious leaders were actually bought out by politicians to support them. We see that it's easily able to happen on their side, so they do not ban this explicitly, and there's not a general consensus that this should not be done at all, which should not be brought into religious spaces at all. On our side, we're less coercive and we're less prone to corruption. I'll take a POI before the second theme.
Okay, know that if people believe in a religion and want to vote off of that religion so they follow their leaders for guidance, you haven't shown us why that's fundamentally wrong. You shouldn't be stopping Christians from voting off of their Christian beliefs if that's what they believe in.
Okay, the first thing to point out is just that we are not stopping Christians from voting on their beliefs, because that can still happen on our side of the house. If they believe that abortion is something that's fundamentally a sin, they can vote Republican without actively needing this motion, or actively needing a leader to say and speak that on their behalf. But more importantly, though, we told you the exclusive difference is that many people are born to religion, and religion is something that is ultimately fundamentally coercive to an extent, and this is proven through many studies, like where debaters we notice. So for instance, disobeying religion entails the threat of eternal damnation. Many of these things are things that are exclusively exclusively and uniquely coercive to these individuals. So we see that that is often fundamentally bad, and that is a crucial difference between both sides. I'll talk about the second theme on politicization and politics as a whole. The first thing to point out is just that we had two lines of content on our bench. The first reason is just that we see ultimately they failed to separate religion from the state. As Jessica proven to us, that it's often quite bad for many politics and religion to be combined as a whole. When your religion determines your value and outlook on life, politics is a way to get those values instilled in broader society. It is bad because first, I want to flip the corruption argument. It is easier for you to be prone to corruption when your religious leader is able to influence the sort of political vote and your political state in society due to coercive measures of the power of religion. That is something that it's hard for us to objectify and quantify. That is overall harmful. But more importantly, though, we told you that this is often something that's often quite harmful when you fail to have the state being able to make policies independent of religion, due to the fact that the state often has to cater to a vast majority of voters. And once voters are voting purely based on religion, you get from a religious view spread to the state. Opposition will come back to state and say this is something that is good. But the reason why we say this is not good is just because religious matters are something that is exclusively non-adjudicable from the state from the perspective of the state. It cannot be debated, it cannot be researched, and it cannot be studied by state officials. No one actually knows whether God exists or not. No one actually knows whether God's word was this or that. And that means that there's generally a lack of ability to hold these sort of opinions accountable, and a lack of ability to actually have accountability given the fact that you cannot even have discourse on these matters. That's what is exclusively bad about this. But the second line of content I want to bring exclusively is why polarization happens far more on their side of house in a world where this can be allowed. And I think there are two reasons why this is true. The first point is just that religions are absolute. You must follow your God or else you'll be punished. Often it's hard to respond to religious views because you can't fact check or refute a religious view. And that is many people support policy because their religion supports it. And that often means that they don't actually believe the policy is beneficial to quality of life. There happens to be much less discourse on their side of the house because it just ends up not being whether this is the most effective policy to solve this issue, and we debate on that, but rather this is God's view. You cannot physically refute that. But the second point is just that it makes political opinions more deadlocked because you have many people smearing the other political side for going against a religion. That makes discourse far more, like, literally more vicious and far worse as for people as a whole, because people's fundamental moral views are being refuted, people's opinions and communities are being put into the game too, and that makes deadlocks far more likely to occur, and that makes deadlocks more vicious, and the entirety of the community when discourse happens far more violent and overall bad. The comparative on our side then is where religion is less entangled with politics. Religious individuals make the link on their own. They don't purposely bring religion into their own political opinions, and that happens. And when that happens, we see that is far more effective for our policy making. But also, you just have far less deadlocks because you're no longer trying to refute the religion behind that view. You're only refuting that opinion. That is the crucial difference on our side versus their side. We see our side is better for overall polarization to decrease and for politics to be better. The last thing I want to do then is just to point out that even if they say corruption happens, we see corruption, we buy into their corruption argument, we buy into their practical argument, we see that's likely to be symmetric. And I think the reason for that is because if it is the case that corruption can easily happen from this corrupt government, then those religious institutions on their side will already have been corrupt. Those religious institutions, if it is the case that the government is so corrupt, they can easily ban certain religions, then we see that on their side of house, they don't need this policy to be the exclusive measure to use that corrupt power. If it is the case that the government really favors one religion over another, then presumably they have many other metrics and many other abilities to enforce that corruption into society and to enforce that religion to be stronger than the other smaller religions next to it. It's unclear why this policy is the exclusive way. On our side, the way is very simple. This is the exclusive policy that can prevent this sort of things from happening. Religion is something that is exclusively and uniquely coercive to individuals, and it's something that is uniquely hard to refute and uniquely hard to have a discourse on. On our side, when that link is not exclusively made by religion, we say it's better on our side of a house.
All right, thank you for the point speech. Now to invite the deputy leader of opposition or the second speaker from the negative team. Ready when you are.
Perfect. Am I audible and visible?
You're loud and clear.
Cool. My name is Alex Lee. I'll be giving the second as well as the reply later for Ryan Ruby, and I'll please take POIs either visually, so just wave your hand, or in the chat, please. Panel. First and second prop are so remarkably different that I almost thought they were on opposite sides for a second. Because on one hand, Jessica gives 8 minutes of material on why people shouldn't vote on religion, why it's wrong. Not a minute later, on the other hand, Alina's very first clarification is that, never mind, we didn't actually mean that. On one hand, Jessica claims people who follow religion are only driven by eternal damnation, and they think they're going to die if they don't follow God. But then on the other, Alina claims that those same people on their side are somehow able to make better decisions that are not equally coercive. On one hand, Jessica talks about increased corruption under our side of the house. Alina again knifes this in the last 20 seconds of her speech by claiming that those corrupt institutions are symmetric and will always be symmetric and will therefore always be corrupt in the first place. I think on those grounds, Op is so much further ahead in this debate. A couple of things I'm going to do in this speech. Firstly, I'm going to refute down proposition material. Secondly, I'm going to rebuild what Jake told you in first before finally introducing our third and final substantive argument. Okay, let's respond to some of the things that proposition tells you. The first option they bring to you is about coercive self-politics. I want to give a couple of summative responses. At the top, note that this argument is about politics generally, as I mentioned in my POI, which can still be talked about publicly under their side of the house. So the motion specifies candidates or elections specifically. Their mechanization here is lazy, because if their substantive is about coercion, then absolutely these religious leaders can still talk about their political opinions. They can still talk about why gay people are bad. They can still talk about why climate change legislation shouldn't happen. That's still equally coercive under their side of the house. Those things are obviously already aligned with political parties. You don't need to do that extra work for them. Second thing I want to note, though, is that when they tell you that religious leaders tell you this is the party that is correct in the first place, I'm not sure why this doesn't happen symmetrically under your side either. Because the Bible, for instance, comments on things like political issues and concepts all the time, and religious followers still necessarily understand those things. You don't need the leader of your church to necessarily espouse that to recognize that your religious beliefs adhere to this party or that one. I don't think religion in the modern era also is as archaic as Prop characterizes it to be. Most people aren't driven by eternal damnation, right? They aren't that religious. They just attend church on Sundays and follow text generally. I think this is a much more charitable characterization. Even if you don't buy that though, people are actually probably motivated more by economics and politics, especially in a world ridden by skyrocketing inflation, a world plagued by humanitarian violations, and in a world where families are just unsure if they can afford their next meal. I'm not sure why their biggest motivator is whether or not their heart being weighed on the scales of hell is going to actually matter. The second thing they tell you is, lots of religious people don't view religion as political anyways. So our argument is that they can keep it that way. They can isolate those two things in the first place. I don't think people are stupid in general, panel. I think it's possible for them to see their pastor supporting a candidate on social media or espousing that to the public, but also be able to think for themselves and have personal political engagements. This isn't coercion. This is just how a marketplace of ideas works. It's not about the case. It's also not going to be the case, right? That in your Sunday morning worships under your side of the house, religious leaders can still talk about that stuff privately under your side of the house. That's what Jake already tells you. But we think this is going to be far worse because these things necessarily are secluded. They're not available to things like social accountability. They're not available to be corrected by the public. They're not available for things like backlash from politics. Instead, they happen completely secluded, completely privately within the walls of the church itself. We think all that still happens, and therefore all that coercion still happens. It's just society isn't there to witness it and isn't there to check back against it. But even if you don't believe anything I just told you, let's take them on their absolute highest ground for a second and assume that, sure, this is coercive. Sure, it results in religious individuals voting based off religion. Even then, I'm unclear as to why this is wrong. I want to give you an analogous example here. Let's say I care about my family a lot and that I'm likely to vote based on that value. Is it then wrong for my mother to talk about Biden at the dinner table, even if I care a lot about what she's going to say? No, that's not coercion. That's me being able to listen to other people who are equally espousing their freedom of speech in the first place. And that's me being able to vote off that principle. And I don't think there's any defense, any rigorous argumentation from proposition as to why this is even remotely bad. Second substance they give you is, but religion instills values in their life. And obviously there's levels of corruption because political parties are going to cater to religious leaders to get their votes. First of all, this isn't even the case in the status quo panel. You still have symmetric incentives for politicians to cater to certain churches because of things like campaign donations that can still happen. They largely do want the support in the first place. Secondly, though, their first substantive also just knifes this one in the back, right? If it's so true that religious individuals care about their religion like it's life or death, like there's eternal damnation, then parties are still going to cater to that religion anyways. The delta is just non-existent here.
Yeah.
Second thing that we hear from Proposition 2, rather, in the chat, please, is that you can still vote on religion on our side. We just don't want religious leaders to declare which candidates are better. Wait, why not? Because if it's true that people voting based on their religion is a good thing, like you admit after Jake told you it was, then why shouldn't those people be able to look to their leaders for help or for an opinion? I'm not sure why this is defended either from Prop 2. Second thing coming out of Prop 2 is that the way religious leaders link politics to religion is by bringing God into it. This is correct based on God or whatever, this is true according to God's vision or appeal or whatever. And then you're then forced into that opinion. Wait, what? But you just said that it's fine for people to vote based on God. So I'm also unclear as to what the implication of this argument is in the first place. Second thing they tell you is try to respond to Jake's argument about corruption. But I think they completely misunderstood the nuance of it. It wasn't a question of corrupt institutions or about corrupt churches and whether or not political leaders are going to cater to it. It was very, very simple instead. Panel, this is what Jake told you. It's that an interpretation of what constitutes a political opinion is going to differ based on how governments actually want to enforce that thing in the first place. So proposition doesn't get magical fiat power to just say it's going to be uniform in all instances according to how we view it. Rather, it's going to be dependent on the type of government that's going to want to enforce this in the first place. So governments that are authoritarian in nature, that are totalitarian in nature, and that really, really hate things like multiple party politics or hate things like freedom and human rights are actually not going to do this in the way that proposition wants them to do. They're instead going to use this as an excuse to be able to suppress all other political opinions, all other political speech outside of the one that actually supports themselves, outside of the one that actually supports the oppressive state. That was the nuance that both Prop 1 and Prop 2 missed. It's far too late for the third to come back and say anything about it. The extensions here are really simple. The principle is going to be one of your easiest ways out, given they just don't respond to it on that layer. We told you that freedom of speech is an inalienable, fundamental human right, perhaps even the most fundamental one of them all. It's the prerequisite to all other rights like happiness, liberty, right to dissent, right to organize, etc. We told you this is especially true of political speech. It was principally detestable for Prop to restrict speech on the basis that speech may be nebulously harmful. Note that Jessica actually ends up adding an additional link for us on this principle by giving an 8-minute speech indicting people who want to vote based on their religion without any explanation as to why it's wrong. We tell you it's a fundamental tenet of democracy that you're able to do so. Weighing was simple. This principle operates a priori to any consideration of the practical, because it crucially doesn't matter if you buy everything they tell you. It doesn't matter if that speech ends up doing like bad things or if restricting it will result in like material benefits. The action of trying to do so in and of itself is probably morally wrong. Okay, that third substantive then on why you get more backlash on your side. People in general, we tell you, don't like restrictions, especially on freedom of speech. It's going to alienate religious leaders who can influence large swaths of people and sometimes entire countries because it makes them super radical libertarians who don't like the government or the state at all. It can also galvanize people on the right-wing parties to speak out in support of religious leaders or to align with their causes. So in the most charitable of instances, this result can look like leaders choosing to espouse anti-government, anti-party, anti-state, anti-nation rhetoric that tends to be violent, that tends to be condemnable, and inflame political tensions even further. In the more extreme cases, though, we think it's also likely that this may result in things like political or religious espionage, as well as general violent rioting. Two implications. One, you get sheer damage and civil unrest, as well as decrease in safety. Two, you get political turmoil and exacerbation of domestic tensions. On those grounds, I'm so proud to oppose.
Right, thank you for that fine speech. So now to invite the government with
Okay, I'll set up a timer. Two things that I'll talk about in this speech. First, on the principle, and second, on the practical. So first, on the principle, opposition says that there is a right for expression for religious leaders, and that is the first thing that they say. I have three responses to this. Number one, religious followers can still express their views, which means that this only applies to religious leaders, which is a very small amount of the population. Second, there's other ways to express your religion that is not necessary to politics. So for example, religious leaders can talk about like religious theory within their own congregations and talk about their own religion to their own followers. Politics is a very, very like small amount like of the things that of all the things that you can talk about. So it's not a very large restriction on their speech. So the conclusion of this is that it only applies to a small amount of religious leaders, not to the religious followers, which is like 10 people probably in a religion. The second thing that they say that is more important is that people should be able to vote off of religion. I have two responses to this. The first, this is wrong. The purpose of the vote is to hold the state to account because the state must protect you. Like if you give up rights to the state, then it must protect you under the social contract. And the purpose of the state, the vote, as we explained in first, is self-defense against the state because now you can hold them to account. That means that for the state to protect you, the state needs to be improving your quality of life. That means that the function of the vote is to get practical outcomes. So if you are getting more people to vote based on religion, and we think that goes against the purpose of the vote. But second, even if that is not true, we explain why we get people more choice. And note that this isn't a tension, because we can say that this is charitable on your frame, which is that even if it is not the purpose of the vote and people can vote off of religion, we still give them more choice. Why is that true? Because on our side, people can now vote based on religion and policy, so they can see which side the religion falls under instead of having a religious leader tell it to them. So, and maybe it is true, like their response to this is that the Bible has comments on a few things, but they're applicable to both parties, as like our first speaker has explained. So on the left, like religion might appeal to the left because like it gives more money to the poor, or it might appeal to the right because of abortion. But it is up to that individual person to have the choice of which party to actually vote under. We think that gives them more choice instead of taking it away because like the religious leader says so. Our argument here was that religion actually violates the democratic rights to self-expression. Why is the vote very crucial? We said that the vote is like the self-defense against the coercive state, and it is also the freedom of expression. And their response is that not every single religion is coercive. So I have a few responses to this. Number one, most religions are coercive. So like Christianity or Hinduism. And the structural reason for this is because religions have a structural incentive to get more people to follow them. And the best way to do that is with infinite punishment and reward, because now if you have like an infinite afterlife, then more people will follow you. And so even like Buddhism has stuff like reincarnation. So the way that religious leaders will do this is that they will endorse the politics, and then people will believe like, they will probably believe like voting for the person is a good deed that will get me reincarnated in a better way, or it will get me not to go into hell. But even if that is not true, and even if the link is unclear, most people just won't even take that risk. Because if you believe in the religion, and you actually believe in the afterlife, and you actually believe in God, there's really no middle ground here. And so like even if you care about politics, most people just cannot escape from this because it's a very, very large risk that they don't want to take. And so the weighing here is this actually coerces people. A thought experiment that outweighs the principle. If I say that like, oh, if you do not vote for this policy, then I will give you eternal damnation, or I will just attack you and make your quality of life worse. And we think that is like something that I'm not allowed to do, even if I have the freedom of speech to do it. And the reason is this like restriction is actually justified, because restricting my freedom of speech is justified because it violates other people's freedom of expression by threatening them with like the eternal punishment, because now they're forced to vote for a politician that they might not like otherwise. I'll take the POI before moving on to the second theme.
Threatening people based on eternal damnation happens symmetrically on your side, except in this case, it's going to happen within the private confines of church meetings, whereas on our side, maybe it happens more publicly, which is where you get that level of social accountability and civic engagement.
Okay, yeah, I was gonna engage with that, but basically, so you say that like this policy is not going to work because the religions will just evade it and do it within the private confines. But I think that we have the fiat to just enforce this harder. So we will like just like if the religions are doing this, and we will have like media that get people to report it if they're doing it in private confines. We'll probably just like monitor them more. Or if we get reports that a religion is doing this, which is like probably necessary if you have a very large follower base to actually like to have a very large impact, then we will be able to get reports and we'll be able to ban this or just like enforce it. So that is a very small amount of the impact that's actually happening. Onto the practical thing then. What opposition says is that authoritarian governments will just abuse this. And I have two responses to this. First, this is a this house would motion, and so we have the fiat to just not use this as espionage. So in our model, we said that we just ban them explicitly from doing it. We probably enforce it if they challenge, like, if they say that like religions are just going to do it privately, and we will just not use this as espionage. Our model was quite simple. But second, I don't think this applies to authoritarian states, because in authoritarian states, there's very little politics, there's very little voting, because there's no democracy, there's no like political parties, there's just not much to talk about. So I don't think this applies to the states where the government is incredibly abusive. What we told you on the practical impact was incredibly important. We said that there's lots of deadlock in politics. And what are the reasons that we actually gave to you here? So we said that like when people vote based on religion, they're less likely to engage with the other side. So they vote for the policy simply because their religion supports it, and not because they actually believe that the policy is beneficial to their quality of life. What that means is that there's less discourse. So like if they say that like so on our side they would probably say this policy is good because it helped me, or this is the most effective policy to solve the issue. What that means is that like on their side the policy is actually more deadlocked, and you have more people smearing the other political side for going against the religion instead of having discourse with them. We think that the comparative is that religion is less entangled in politics. Politicians need to convince people that their policy is good, but since they do not have religious legitimacy, the way that they convince the people that their policy is good is by saying, oh, our policy is effective, and by debating other people about how their policy is effective. So what are the impacts here? One, this leads to less effective policy, which is like actually very important, because when the effectiveness of policy isn't being as discussed much, policies aren't being improved as much, especially because religion has a very, very large follower base. And so if lots of people are engaging in this and staying out of discourse, then that is a very large impact. But also, the policies that do get voted in based not on effectiveness, but based on the amount of religion that is going against that is going for it, which is like a reason why less effective policies actually get passed. So the practical impact here is that less effective policies get developed and less effective policies get passed. And so even if the principle is a wash, we think that the practical impacts are quite important because it affects lots of people, even the people that aren't religious and probably like don't want to have a worse quality of life because of less effective policies. And we think this affects a lot of people. It is probably used as a deadlock breaker. So in conclusion, most of their claims from the principle just wash out. We give people more choice. And even if that's not true, we give like better policies. Very proud to propose.
All right, thank you for that fine speech. Now to invite the upward.
Okay, awesome. Hello, my name is Karim. I am the opposition third, pronouns he, him, POI preference is verbal. And I'm just going to go ahead and get started in a few moments. This debate was never about the archaic, absolutist religious beliefs that side government attempted to say was the vast majority. The idea that religious leaders are coercive and they're going to subject you to eternal damnation and hell if you don't vote a certain way or if you don't do a certain action. We think that because side opposition is the only side in this debate that is grounded in reality, that's why we've won this debate. In this speech, I'm going to go over refutation of what we just heard from side government, and then we're going to delve into the two clashes of this debate. First, on which side best catalyzes political change and advocacy, which is the practical side of this debate, and then second, on which side principally protects free speech and which side is prevailing on the principal grounds of this debate. On account of refutation, I just want to point out something and extend a characterization or a note that Alex already gave you, because of the fact that the characterization and stance on religion and in relation to voting has changed 3 times from government. Jessica came up here and told you that voting based on religion is bad, but we didn't really hear any mechanization as to why that's the case. Then Alina comes up here and says that voting is based on religion is actually a good thing. And then Eddie comes up here and says, just kidding, voting is based on religion, and we think that's a bad thing. We think that we needed a consistent stance and a comprehensive account for which one it exactly is, and we think that this is even on the whole detrimental to their bench. Now then, moving into the substantive materials that they gave you, right? They gave you 2 things. First, on coercive self-expression of political views, and then second, on the separation of church and state. For the whole of these 2 arguments, we really just got characterization from proposition on how children inherit religious beliefs and values from parents. It is remarkably unclear what the strategic value of this characterization was. We think that if this was really true, only on our side would you have greater political clarity and values when you're engaging in discourse with religious leaders and about supporting particular parties, policies, or candidates. But think about the comparative here. We think that it is easier for those same coercively imposed and indoctrinated beliefs to circulate around in an echo chamber when you don't have religious leaders actually asserting what their political beliefs that they think should be discussed in these religious contexts, right? We think that it's a lot easier for you to be deadlocked in this sort of area where these like religious beliefs we think are so necessarily important. You have to remember that religion is not only about the influence, it's not the only influence in your life, right? You are influenced by the environment outside of your church, your peers, your coworkers, the marketplace of ideas, where you're likely subjected to a kaleidoscope of political perspectives. This is why we don't buy Proposition's push from their first speaker that you'll be subjected to eternal damnation to hell if you don't vote a certain way. And this is also why we don't buy Proposition's second push from their second speaker that people vote exclusively off of religion. We think the characterization that Proposition should have adopted from first was a significantly more charitable and realistic one that Alex already pointed out to you. That discussion of political beliefs from religious leaders is more reminiscent of your pastor talking in a church or like a sermon of sorts. It's not a situation where all religious leaders tell you that you'll be excommunicated from the church and subjected to die in a terrible, terrible death. Now then, moving on to the two clashes. First, on which side best catalyzes political change and advocacy? We think this clash engages directly with our second substantive, where we explain to you in great detail that you galvanize political support on our side. We told you two very simple things. That number one, you increase civic engagement. You interact with religious leaders and you are compelled to think deeply about different policies and political platforms where you are religious. And number two, you get better activism on our side. We think that religious leaders will be in touch with the progressive ideals and moral compasses of religious individuals in the 21st century. Consequently, we think that religious individuals vote on their own worldly concerns and priorities, but there are instances that if people do decide to vote off of religion, we ought to let them because that's their own beliefs that they've developed for all of their life. Proposition argues that leaders are likely to assert that a certain candidate or party will be supported with like religious justification. The idea that leaders will be like, oh, we support candidate X because God willed them to take office. A number of summative responses here. Number one, the premise of this argument is that people cannot vote off of religious justification. We already dealt with this argument insofar as we proved to you that it's fine for people to vote on and draw on their own beliefs. That's just a part of democracy. The beliefs and values that you develop as a human being that practices religion is one factor among the myriad of elements that play into how you engage in the political process. It's a strange assertion for Proposition Third to say that this is like a bad thing when religion is a core part of you as a human being. That's exactly why religious leaders need to be an important stakeholder that's involved in the political conversation. They should continue to be allowed to assert their political beliefs and have those necessary conversations. To ban them is to completely ruin the political process and ruin discourse, which we think is so valuable in society. But let's take Proposition their highest. Let's assume for a moment that you shouldn't vote off of religion, right? The premise of this argument also assumes that religious individuals are sheep and blindly do what religious leaders tell them to, right? We think that it is reasonable for people to be logical, rational actors. That is to say, people have reason to support a party, support a policy, or get out the vote than more than just their religion. We think, though, that a very important thing to note here in regards to religion is that people are more compelled to just understand what their religious leaders are saying and understand the justification for why that is, more than just being like threatened to just like vote a certain way just because someone said that they'll be subjected to eternal damnation. Before I move on to the second clash, I'll take a point if there is one. 3, 2, 1. Moving on to the second clash, on which side principally protects free speech. This clash ties in well with the first substantive of freedom of speech. Opposition first already did the mechanistic legwork to prove that selective restriction of free speech on the outset is a harmful precedent to create. This is undoubtedly one of the most salient paths to the ballot, because unlike what Proposition Third tells you, this is not a wash because of the lackluster engagement that we got throughout government's bench. Pair all of the analysis that we gave you as to why exactly free speech is so necessarily inherent in the human experience, and pair that with Alex's third substantive on religious leaders backlashing against the government when the government gets to decide what statements are political opinions and what aren't. I think that the biggest strategic error coming out of governments is the lack of proof for why we're past the point of regulation or reform on all of like these extreme ideologies that they are asserting, right? We think that on the whole, the reason as to why exactly side government has failed in this debate and side opposition has prevailed is because we prove to you that you increase civic engagement, you get better activism, you just have better pragmatic outcomes and implications on our side of the house, insofar as there are greater incentives for you to go to an election to understand what your peers and what your fellow religious individuals are saying. And we think that the discourse that you get from religious leaders asserting what they think is important to understand, we think those are the things that you only get on our side of the house. Consider the comparator for a moment. We did not get a comprehensive account as to the net harms of voting on a religious basis. We did not get a comprehensive account as to why exactly the things that religious leaders are saying right now, in the vast majority of instances, are a bad thing. We think these are all things that side government needed to prove in order to have a chance at saying that they won this debate. What side opposition gave you was a principle and a practical justification for why exactly these leaders ought to be able to use their free speech and ought to be able to have a conversation and open a line of discourse with fellow religious individuals on what exactly they should do, what policies they should support. We want to remind you of the illustration that we gave you from the very beginning of this debate. How Pope Francis, for example, supported climate legislation, how you see that a lot of the religious leaders and their advocacy and what the political statements they're putting out is very much in line with the kind of conversation that we need to see more of. Because only on side opposition do you have those conversations, those valuable lines of discourse that we think are limited on our side of the house. We have clearly won this debate. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you for the fine speech. To conclude the opposition case, I would like to invite the opposition to reply.
Wonderful. Am I still audible?
You are loud and clear.
I'm going to examine the two key clash questions that are going to seal your ballot for the opposition. Firstly, why are we just so far ahead on the principle level? Note that this is the easiest way out for an independent path to the ballot for our side here, because we gave you solid analysis and weighing since the very first speech, and it's been extended down every single speech with very, very little, if none, principle engagement from them at all. Prop Whip tries to do a 20-second blip on this by saying the principle doesn't matter because we're worried about practical considerations. It is net better for us to be able to restrict these voices. We already answered this implicitly within our nuanced analysis by telling you that this condition operates a priori to any consideration of the practical, that it doesn't matter if you completely buy their case, that restricting this kind of speech is going to be net beneficial in the end, because the action of a government doing that in and of itself is principally and morally detestable. I think on that ground, you can automatically sign your ballot. But I'll ask the second question, why are we better on the practical level as well? What did we give you here? Our characterization of voters and religious individuals was the much more true one out of the two in this round. Firstly, we told you these voters aren't trembling in fear of eternal damnation every single day. They're more motivated, rather, by their economic conditions and by political situations like inflation or wages, or whether or not they're going to be able to keep a job, or whether or not they're going to be able to afford their next meal. Second thing they told you is that they're not stupid, right? They're not ideological slaves to their pastors. They can go to church on Sundays and then come home and watch the Washington Post largely separately. But even if you think they can't, we told you that voting based on your religion and voting based on what your leaders and preachers that you believe will say is 100% fine under what the purpose of voting is. Prop Whip quite literally says, quote, voting should be the freedom of expression. We agree. That is, voting is the freedom to express your voice, whatever your voice may be, whether it be religiously founded or not. Given that characterization, then, our side sees a world where people like Pope Francis can speak for climate change legislation and speak for better welfare of the poor. It's a world where the racist and bigoted Westboro Baptist Church leaders came under heavy fire from the public, which held them accountable only because they were able to espouse those views in that public sphere of social accountability. It's a world where you get voters who are better able to have civic engagement, who otherwise wouldn't have had that engagement within the walls of their church because they weren't interested politically beforehand. It's a world that is net better in every way. What's the comparative on their side? Prop Whip is remarkably abusive here. He answers literally 3 of our crucial arguments with, we're actually just going to fiat that away. And the answer doesn't work in any of the cases. First thing we told you is that religious leaders are just going to instead espouse those opinions privately, right, within the walls of their own churches, within, Sunday morning worships, etc. And his answer is that he's just going to fiat it harder. 1, the motion literally says public, so you don't even get the fiat for private. But 2, this probably should have been in your model from an hour ago, right? It's abusive to suddenly shift this in the last 20 seconds of your last speech. Second thing we told you is that we told you that religious backlash might happen, that churches are going to get mad and become more anti-state, more anti-government. This was my third substantive, and that all of this might result in things like espionage or violent rioting from the action of the churches. Eddie's answer is that he's just going to fiat it harder. Again, you don't get to do that. This was an argument about backlash from the churches. You don't get to control what they do in reaction to the motion. Third, we told you that different governments, especially authoritarian ones, were going to interpret this motion differently. And therefore, authoritarian regimes will use it as an excuse to ban only the speech they want to, the speech that dissents against their state. Again, same pattern. Their answer is, we'll just fiat that harder. Again, to be clear, panel, the only fiat that prop gets in any debate is that they get to assume that the motion passes in the way it is worded. They don't get to assume that it is A, enforced perfectly, or that B, everyone is happy about it in the end. On those grounds, I'm so proud to oppose.
All right, thank you for that fine speech. That concludes the government opposition case. To invite the opposition reply to conclude the government case, I'd like to invite,
Okay, cool. Sounds good. I'll start in 3, 2, 1. The reason why we got increasingly confused as the round went on is because opposition seems to want to win by tangling the separate lines of impact and argumentation we give when different parts of the case operate on different levels. The first thing they do is that they skew our characterization on what this motion actually applies to. Within first, we say it is coercive for people to be influenced by religious leaders to vote a certain way. In second, what we did was respond to the wrong opposition summary of what we meant, rather they try to frame that into attention. Because what we said on our side of house wasn't that voting based on religious views was inherently bad, but rather that it is wrong for their religious leaders to tell them how to vote. So it's not wrong that people vote because of their religion, but it is wrong that their religion tells them to vote a certain way. That's a crucial difference. What we told you in second then was that on our side, we would rather prefer these individual members to make the choice on their own of what they believe which political party best fulfills their religion, rather than the religious leader making the link for them. So it is unclear on whether their side is actually the one who is. It's unclear whether their characterization for our case is actually correct. We told you in our side, there's a crucial difference between what they say we support and what we actually support. There are two things I want to discuss then. Firstly, on the idea of the principle in this round and the clash on that, and secondly, on the idea of politics as a whole. Under the principle, the opposite principle is that any limit on freedom of speech is something that is automatically unjust. But we told you down the bench that there are certain limits we have on the freedom of speech already. So for instance, misinformation is banned, and there are already limits on freedom of speech due to the fact that misinformation takes away agency from people and the ability to make a proper choice. Coercion operates in the same manner. That's what we told you down our bench. That coercion forces people to have a loss of agency when they're unable to make that choice based on their own genuine thoughts and instead forced and coerced into making a decision a certain way. The difference between Alex's mother and the Pope is that the Pope claims to carry the voice of an internal, all-powerful figure that can have unlimited power in people's lives. And that's where our case has been very clear and very unique. We told you that religion is something that is exclusively coercive in a way that average individuals around us are not. So opposition can't just respond to our principle using one response that, we allow other people to say their voices. That is the only response they genuinely kind of give down a bench. So it is unclear whether they actually properly gave principle refutation towards our response. So at the end of this claim then, we say we prove that this often is something that is coercive and uniquely coercive to individuals, that people are unable to make a choice and decision for themselves. But at our very worst case, if it's the case that people will make this choice anyways, then we say it's just unclear why this is an act of harm. If people will make the same choice on either side of the house. Instead, we say at least we give people the potential to make that choice for themselves. On our side, it is better. Under the idea of the practical then, they say that, your side is one that doesn't actually have public discourse because this happens within the confines of the church, while on their side, it happens in public. The first issue with this is just that religious leaders talk about their political opinions in church. That's literally been clear from a model from first. So the Pope isn't going to go to TED Talks and speak on why the Republican Party is the true savior of humanity. On our side of the house, when we make choices on religion on our own individually, their side is the one that's actually made within the social structure of church. When individuals make choices on their own, they're actually able to have discourse with those around them. But second, we told you as a claim uniquely from second that it is easy for people to be abused by religious leaders. That many religious leaders are actually ones who have their own opinions, who are easily able to have corrupt and have their own self-interested in mind. So we say it is easy on their side for these religious leaders to utilize that coercive power over the people for their own benefits. And so if they want to win on corruption and overall public scrutiny, we say it is hard for people to have public scrutiny on these religious leaders due to the fact, as we told you down the bench, that religion is something that is non-refutable, that is hard to fact check, that is hard to hold accountable inherently. That is a unique case we told you. But lastly, we told you down our bench that often we have we have far more choices and diversity on our service because we separate the state from the religion as a whole from the start. Eddie clarified in third that religious voting wasn't bad, but rather the practical argument here is very simple. That on their surveillance, they combine religion and politics as a whole, and that often leads to negative and harmful influences. They say that our case relies on the premise that these people are archaic, but that is untrue, given that our case is very simple, that even if it is unarchaic, even if it is progressive, it is still wrong that people vote based on what other people tell them to vote, and not based on their own genuine opinion. It is unclear how they try to trade between the both. So the last thing to point out is just that our case was never that it is wrong that people vote because of their personal religious views. It is wrong because their religious views are now tainted by the religious views of the religious leader. On that basis, very proud to propose.
Right, cool. That concludes round 2's debate. Ooh, thank you very much. Give me a moment. Let me just stop recording.